Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the Newsmaker interview that is concluding a very busy week. I suspect that we may have some guests with us here today that are here for the open house. Welcome to you as well. I'm Gordon Middleton, Director of the Strategic Intelligence Program here at Patrick Henry College. Let me just extend my welcome to you, especially to our visitors. Today, we are very honored to have with us Mr. David Shedd, a longtime member of our Board of Advisors for our SI program here at Patrick Henry College. Also a regular, I was searching for the right word there, guest speaker in our SI Guest Lecture Series. So he's very familiar with the college, with our students, with our program. And we're just very honored to have you with us today, David. Let me just share a little bit about your background, and then we'll go from there. Most recently, from 2007 until 2010, David Shedd was the Deputy Director for National Intelligence for Policy, Plans, and Requirements, where he formulated and implemented major intelligence community policies across a very broad range of issues, all the way from information sharing, intelligence community authorities, analytic standards, and a number of other areas. In that position, you led the executive order review of Executive Order 12333, as it's called, the foundation of U.S. intelligence activities and policies, which was then signed by President George W. Bush in July of 2008. The subsequent years, 2010 to 2014, he served as the Deputy Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and then subsequent to that, up until just last month, as Acting Director of the DIA, pending the appointment of its current director. With that sort of as backdrop, the bookends being you started off as a missionary kid in Latin America, and you ended up as the director of the nation's senior military intelligence organization. What did that look like in between those sort of two bookends, and how did that all happen?
Well, first, again, I want to say it is indeed a privilege to be here today and have this opportunity to talk to the audience here, as well as conduct this interview. When I look back over the nearly 33 years of service in government, I'm struck by what was the foundation for having that interest in, one, coming into government, and secondly, I'm going to open the aperture to say service in the area of national security. And we'll get into some of the details about an intelligence career, but really about national security. And to the best of my ability and recollection, which is still fairly good at the ripe age of 55, I can tell you that it goes back to a period of time on the mission field in Chile in 1970, 1971, and 1972. For those who don't recall the history, there was an election of a Marxist president, Salvador Allende, there, and I was very intrigued as an 11-year-old, 10, 11-year-old, by the amount of attention that this was getting. And it was, I think that's probably the closest I can come to saying at that point, ignited in my heart was an interest and eventually a passion for trying to truly understand foreign policy. What goes into it? How does it work? What contributes to successful policy as well as potentially failures, and we may talk about that a little more in your questions. All to say that from that point on, I really had a profound interest in growing up overseas, as I said, in Chile at that point in my childhood, with international relations and U.S. policy and so forth. Obviously, I didn't quite put it all together at the age of 10 or 11, but it certainly was, I think, what ignited in my heart an interest for that. I went to Geneva College then in 1977, where I met my now lovely wife of nearly 34 years on the second day of college, and she's sitting right there. And as we started our journey through our 4 years of undergraduate, I felt that the Lord leading to have me go to a place that would actually strengthen that understanding of international relations by going to Georgetown University and the School of Foreign Service with an emphasis area of Latin America, which was a very natural thing. And at that point, I went into the area of international relations and government from that point forward. So that's kind of how that end of the bookend, or that part of the career gets started. But it really does go back well before I actually joined the government.
As you've related in some of our previous conversations, obviously our discussions today are done in the context of a potential reporting of some of this in World Magazine, that you had indicated there was some extended interaction and familiarity with World Magazine, and that your father had apparently encouraged, and I'm curious as to the extent to which, or if that did play into the development of some of these interests that you just described.
Well, my father, it's an interesting story there. He was a follow-on generation missionary. My grandparents went what I described as pioneer missionaries to Bolivia. And so always in the home, the area of international relations was a topic of conversation. And it was at a time when we didn't even have television in the home. And so what did you do? You talked about things. Actually, it does work pretty well. Talk over world affairs, have debate, have conversations that engender that. World Magazine eventually became a mainstay on my dad's coffee table, my mom and dad's coffee table, because it one, reflected their values, and I think it reflected a perspective on the world as a God-centered perspective of world events that I think challenged them, and particularly my dad, to think about events in the context of our world belief that God is ultimately in control, no matter how badly things are going in the external part of the world from outside the four walls of that home.
Very good. You have been known for your faith. As you have faced some of the major challenges in your own professional career, in your positions of responsibility in various organizations, including various agencies, how has your background as a Christian been part of you dealing with some very challenging circumstances and situations? And in part of that, have you ever been in a situation where you felt conflicted between what might be perceived as the mission requirements or the policy that was being directed and your values as a Christian, and how did you deal with that?
Well, it's by God's grace and God's grace alone that by having a very firm foundation of an understanding between right and wrong, I brought to the workplace an equally keen understanding that I will say, as I often do, I wish I had known what I know today, had known that when I was 25, 35, 45. So clearly there's a maturing and a growing in wisdom over time in applying that. But that foundation never faltered between right and wrong. Starting, of course, with the Ten Commandments and what's clearly a worldview that I have that God ultimately has, contrary to generally what you hear out there, that truth is relative and so forth. I never bought into that. And again, it goes back to having a very strong foundation. When I think of tensions in carrying out that faith in practical terms, I go back to an era in the mid-1980s. And it goes back to what eventually became, when it was opened up to the media, to Iran-Contra. I had nothing to do with the Iran portion of it, but I was in Central America, so you can all figure out which side of that equation I was associated with. And what I came away with, without getting into the histrionics of the 85, 86 time period, there was, Congress had passed a law called the Boland Amendment. The Boland Amendment prohibited lethal aid from being passed from the U.S. government to the Nicaraguan resistance, which is how I knew them and in fact respected them as such, to the Sandinista regime in Managua. And I became one of those who, in my view, ultimately exceeded the authorities that I believe were instantiated in the law, the Boland Amendment, and that private benefactors eventually were delivering through channels of the U.S. government assistance that was lethal assistance to the Nicaraguan resistance. And you have to understand, you get caught up in the moment, you clearly believe in the mission, you believe in what their objectives were, but what I came away with was a soul-searching moment, which lasted a good number of months after the story broke, of how I should have done things differently. And did I, in fact, in a nation that is governed by law and governed by the Constitution, did I get to select my favorite sort of mission topic and then pursue it regardless of what the law said? And I had to ask myself, would I do that all over again? And the answer would be absolutely not. Notwithstanding still believing in that particular mission of the Nicaraguan resistance. It was very divisive in the nation at the time. As you will recall, as the hearings were held, a number of senior officials were fired from the U.S. government and so forth as a result of that. And there's always that pending question, did President Reagan ever know? I don't have the answer, by the way, today. But the point is that it gave me, at a very early point in my career, a very poignant example of where I really had to be challenged with still doing the right thing, even when it might be at the expense of potentially even my employment.
Well, thank you for sharing that interesting window on your own personal experiences. If we might do a little bit of come back to the current, obviously much of what you ended up dealing with in your last several positions were more current threats to national security around the world. The classic question that you've had direct insight into is, what keeps our senior executives awake at night, or at least there are areas of concern relative to most significant risks to our national interests, to American citizens at home and abroad, and even threats domestically? How do you see the landscape today?
The current landscape is extraordinarily complicated today because what you have is a confluence of threats to the United States and its friends and allies, Israel in particular, but also Europe and our friends and allies in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. That is this confluence of what I believe is an attack on the international order. An international order of the Westphalian states and its borders, and we are having a concurrent attack on that international order by state actors like Vladimir Putin, who, with the reascendance of Russia in seeking to restore some of the grandeur of Mother Russia in its near abroad, in the Ukraine principally today, but really it encircles what were the nation states of the former Soviet Union, threats to the Baltic countries, to other Eastern European countries, and as I affectionately call them, the stands along the lower end of the former Soviet Union. And he is very active in that regard. We see it in the case of China and Xi Jinping, in the East and South China Sea, in their activities. Those are the state actors that are involved in that, not to mention, of course, Iran and North Korea, and I just did, also are challenging the international order by way of what they believe are their prerogatives to determine what form of international behavior they will follow. And I believe that's really, really testing the boundaries of international order. Concurrently, then, you have the non-state actors. And if you think of the threat from terrorism far more as a pandemic rather than an individual group, and that's not to minimize at all what the Islamic State or Daesh is doing by way of its horrific deeds, most recently with the kidnapping that appears to be upwards of 200 Christians in northern Syria, or the beheadings along the Libya coastline of 21 Coptic Christians from Egypt, and of course the burnings and all that. That is not to minimize that at all. But if, to your question, stand back from it, and the idea of establishing a caliphate has nothing to do with the borders of what we know today, and borders that essentially have been in place for at least 100 years in the Middle East, going back to really about 100 years ago, that were set, the Syrian and the Iraqi border and so forth. And so what keeps and should keep awake anyone that deals with this is this multipolar world that is a very diverse in its interests, but one thing that unites it by way of the threats to us is this challenge to the international order.
This is not intended to be a political question.
But it's going to be, right?
But it may have some of that edge to it. To what extent do you think that range of actors, both state and non-state, let's just say, may have taken some encouragement to be more aggressive given the defense posture and stated policies of the United States that in many ways is almost unavoidably being interpreted as the U.S. is starting to draw back more to its own territorial interests, focus on domestic. I mean, our current president was largely elected on a domestic agenda, not on an international agenda. To what extent do you think the United States posture the last half a dozen or more years may be a factor in some of those, what a former DNI termed the snakes and scorpions, coming out from underneath their rocks and pushing on some of those international boundaries as you've described?
Let me attempt to give you what I believe to be a fair and balanced response. There are those on one side of the equation who wish to see us go back to essentially a world that I described as simplistic, of a bipolar world. That world does not exist anymore. That is a world that you either were with the Soviet Union in that bipolar world of those 50 years or so, to the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, or you were with the United States. That's where I began my career in 1982. And it's a world that in some ways was simpler, not simplistic, but simpler to understand, because you're either with us or against us. And as I like to say, Switzerland was kind of the one that was neutral, but there weren't many. That world is not a world that I think we can begin to aspire to return to, and it certainly does not exist today. Witness alone what we know as an acronym as the BRICS, the Brazils and the Russia, South Africa, India, China, and so forth. They will rise and fall to their self-interest, some of them with significant economic capability and presence in the world, China, for example, to do so. Now, the other side of the equation, I said I'd try to be fair and balanced, is that if you ignore that at its very foundation, inherent evil exists in the world, or at least try to wish it away or describe it away as something other than evil in the heart of man, you will ultimately have very different policy outcomes that will generally try and accommodate rather than respond to
Or confront.
or confront. And there will be confrontation avoidance because you come to believe that if it's not inherently evil, there is space for negotiation on it. And some of those that former President George W. Bush described as evildoers, in my personal view, do not understand anybody that approaches them from a perceived or actual state of weakness. That's where the snakes and the scorpions come out.
Yes.
Today, those snakes and the scorpion states and non-state actors have alternatives of where they garner their support. Some in outright ungoverned space, as we see Libya completely come apart in a major way in what on the surface is tribal warfare. Below the surface, it's al-Sharia, and it's the groups that I believe, again, the Islamic State will take full advantage of. Or the state actors, as I've already mentioned, certainly in the name of Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, the great Ayatollah of Iran, and so forth. I do not ever see them coming to the negotiating table with a counterpart that is in a weakened state and having a good outcome in those discussions.
Maybe if we could piggyback just for a moment on the Putin and Russia topic that you raised. Also, as someone who spent the vast majority of my professional career sort of during the Cold War era, seeing the transformed Russia today is more than a little bit of a back to the future. There's also, it appears to me, a very challenging, almost role reversal going on here, that Putin is posturing Russia as the light on the hill, the Christian savior of the world, opposed against the secular, degenerate, barbarian Western culture, referring to us, that is almost an exactly flip. In fact, you could almost do a global word replace in some of the statements from 30, 40 years ago, that I would just say, as a Christian, is very challenging. Any comment or reaction to where that leaves us strategically in attempting to confront someone like a Putin, who appears to be, at least posturing, to take that sort of not only high ground, but even Christian high ground?
Well, I mean, I would challenge as I believe you would and wouldn't imply, the Christian value of Vladimir Putin. What he has done is very successfully built a coalition around him of the Russian Orthodox Church, the oligarchs, and then taking his message to the Russian people, who are historically known to be extraordinarily long-suffering, so that when you think about the effects of sanctions, economic sanctions on Russia today, and still have an individual in Vladimir Putin that has about an 80% approval rating and popularity inside Russia, you'd say there's an enormous disconnect. Well, there isn't actually, because if you think about his sort of spiritual level values of what he sees for Russia, he is an artful communicator in defending Mother Russia. And it is a country that, as he himself has acknowledged, lost at the end of the previous century one of the greatest losses for Mother Russia imaginable, which was the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Yes.
And he holds people like Gorbachev and others directly responsible for having lost the Cold War by any other term. And he is everywhere out there pushing a message to restore Russia to its state of grandeur, whatever that may mean in his own mind and to the Russian people. But we should not fool ourselves into thinking it does not pose an enormous threat to Europe, to the United States interests, and we see that being executed in eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk, in Luhansk, Mariupol, as he creates a bridge over from Crimea and so forth. I don't think he's anywhere close to stopping. The other thing I will also say about Mr. Putin is that I believe that he has walked away from some extraordinary lessons learned actually from the United States. Lessons learned of two major physical wars, that being Iraq and Afghanistan. He is masterfully integrating information. He is masterfully building information operations. He is masterfully using the cyber network capabilities to conduct really 21st century warfare, notwithstanding that its outward manifestation of that is the occupation of eastern Ukraine.
Do you have any good news for us? No,
The Lord is coming.
Amen. Picking up on the cyber topic, some have asserted in our academic area of freedom here, not citing yourself by name, that one of the unleft areas in the last update to the executive order on the intelligence community activities, 12333, that the whole cyber area was one that we didn't really make as much progress as we might have liked. And certainly in retrospect, I think many would agree with that assessment. Is the cyber agency that is now being discussed the answer to provide cybersecurity to the American public and U.S. industry? And what's the likelihood that this is actually going to prevent subsequent issues like the Sony attack and others that have come before it? You've spoken on this topic broadly before. Share with your perspective on where all this is headed, and if you have any specific comments with regard to the cyber agency that's being proposed, I think our audience would be interested in that as well.
Unfortunately, in the world of cyber, we don't have the 100 years or so that it took to develop the law of the seas. Remember, piracy was, and it did come back for a while, but it was the one thing that united the world that eventually led to a series of international guidelines and laws, ultimately, on governing what we call the law of the seas. We don't have 100 years with cyber because it's moving extraordinarily fast in terms of governance and the newness of the challenges associated with cyber. Because while it's out in the ether, it's also physically based in locations, obviously, where the servers reside and so forth. Enormous challenges, as we've seen with the Edward Snowden case, over bringing to the forefront the debate of privacy and civil liberties associated with what's required to protect versus what is required then to put in evidence and put into the hands of the government in terms of that knowledge. All to say is that I think it's very much in its early stages of work in progress. Here is my great fear, Dr. Middleton, is that, like so often has been the case, we have been unable to get ahead of the proverbial tsunami of the attacks or the attack that could be coming and I believe will come in the area of cyber, and preventing that by having, in fact, clearly delineated policies and directives in how to operate in that space. And I think at the crux of the issue of cyber is the American people, and I will stick to the U.S. domain. The American people seem perfectly comfortable that in the commercial world, your local retailer and your local pizza vendor can tell you the type of pizza you want and everything because, surprise, surprise, they've collected a lot on you already about your tastes and what you desire, how you want your pizza, the type of toppings on it, and whether thick crust or thin crust. The government does the same thing, and there's public outrage. And so we haven't come to terms, and the U.S. Congress, the House, and the Senate have not actually been able to come to terms over the cyber laws and policies that will govern this nation. And frankly, I think the White House is well behind where it needs to be also in pushing that. So my fear is, really in conclusion to your question, is that a cyber agency, a cyber element inside the intelligence community seems to be coming to the party rather late at this point, because we still have a vacuum on policies and directives associated with how is this ungoverned space actually going to be governed? How are those decisions on collect, retain, attack in the cybersphere going to actually be decided? Who's going to decide that? Under what circumstances is that decided?
And those are all yet future discussions, even just within the U.S.-American community, much less the international community.
And if I go back to what I said about the attack on the international order, cyber is a central component of that when it comes to our adversaries. They don't play by any rules that we even would aspirationally have within our domain. I don't think Mr. Putin gets up every day to try and figure out whether he's violating anybody's civil rights in Russia when it comes to cyber. And much less so Daesh or ISIL or the Islamic State has, in fact, they leverage it to the maximum extent possible for their benefit in social media and so forth, as we can see, and for recruiting purposes.
Exactly. With that, we've set a very broad table here before you. I think there are a couple of microphones out there. If you have questions that you would like to ask of Mr. Shedd at this point, please indicate and we'll get you a microphone. Please use the microphone if you would. There's one right here in front. Please introduce yourself and then ask your question, please.
Sure. My name's Miriam McElvain. Thank you so much. I had a quick question about your role and the area that faith plays into it, and you told us a bit about the Iran-Contra affair. But what happens when there's an unjust law? What happens when the direction the government is going in conflicts with God's law or the right and wrongs that we know ethically? And what would somebody in your position, what would their allegiances and their duties be in a conflict like that?
Well, again, because I don't either believe in luck or just
Fate.
coincidences and fate, this morning my wife and I had a devotion about Daniel, Daniel 6. And Darius set out, because he was basically set up by the satraps, to establish what was the law of the Medes and the Persians, which was irrevocable, which eventually we know is Daniel in the lion's den. But this is the pre-stage to it. And the law was that for 30 days, no one would worship anyone outside of, because they could find no fault in Daniel. What did Daniel do? Let me remind you. He went, as he did every day, and changed none of his habits, which was 3 times a day, prayed with his windows open in the direction of Jerusalem. So to your question, if I had been confronted with a moral stricture imposed on me that I would have to execute that was contrary to God's law, my options would be to try and get it overturned or resign. I never faced that. I did think long and hard, what if I were called upon to speak at and then condone by the presence and certainly by the event that's in question a gay pride event in the workplace. And I said that was going to be a conflict for me. And again, I love the sinner. I cannot condone the sin. And so in my walk to this date, which again, providentially happens to be my last day in government in nearly 33 years. So it's truly a privilege to be here with you today and doing this interview. I did not face that. However, as predictions go, I predict that everyone that follows me and younger will face more of it. Because the moral challenges in the marketplace, the workplace, government, and corporate America, don't draw much of a distinction, in our military, wherever that is, are going to increase, absent a significant revival in our nation, which of course would have to begin with believers being revived.
Amen.
You don't revive the dead.
Amen. Thank you. Another question here in front. Was there also a hand in the back that I saw or not?
Hi, my name is Taylor Burke. As previously mentioned, you have been and still are strongly affiliated with Patrick Henry College. As you enter this transitional period in your life and career, how do you see that relationship evolving, or do you?
I do. So I'll start with the end of your question. I see it evolving into greater engagement with you. I have a passion for young people, and particularly a passion for young people who wish to be the Daniels and Shadrach, Meshachs, and Abednegos going into government service. As we read in Romans 13, government is established, and there is great goodness to government. It obviously creates the law and order that we have with all its warts and everything, but still in a nation state, that order. And I believe, as our Lord Jesus Christ himself pointed out on the Sermon on the Mount, I believe in Matthew 5:13 through 16, about being salt and light, this is one place to carry that out. The investment that I can make in students at Patrick Henry College and elsewhere is very, very important to me. I think your challenges are very different than my last 30-plus years in a world, as I've already alluded in answering the previous question, by way of the moral decay in our society that you will face. That is, however, not an excuse to not get involved and be a part of that political system. We were called as disciples of Jesus Christ to be in the world, not of the world. And being in the world, wherever God opens the doors, obviously, that may very well be government. And so that's where, and I'm very pleased to be thinking that Patrick Henry will actually have a major in strategic intelligence. And I think that's a wonderful development.
Another question from the audience. A couple here. Go ahead. Right here in front, and then on that side. And
Thank you for coming.
One of the younger students.
Yes. I'm on the 20-year plan. Thank you very much for coming. I work with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network within the U.S. Treasury. And the one thing I want to ask you, which gives me unease, is how do you balance within your own mind and the people underneath you between liberty and security and safety? We've have a bureau that started out with a mission mandate, a very good mission with organized crime, add on to it terrorism, and recently tax evasion. So I always see a never completion of a mission. It's always an expanding mission, expanding regulations. And when do you get to that point where you say, we're at the tipping point of taking away too much liberty and asking too much of people?
It probably comes as no surprise when I would say to you that when man tries to fix anything, his answer, and this is mankind, and the structures that underwrite and undergird that, the answer appears to legislate more, to grow bureaucracy, to expand the mission as you described, and legislate your way through those issues. And that, to me, is a manifestation of man's inability or unwillingness to actually see the spiritual dimension to, again, the behavior of mankind as originally fallen and in desperate need of restoration. And so what occurs is that, and as I saw it even in my own bureaucracies that I saw below me, I saw growing inspector general offices, I saw greater general counsel offices, and I'm not demeaning what they do in terms of their core, but talk about a slippery slope of mission. They were kind of in everybody's face on a host of issues that frustrated me even at times of asking myself why were they going there. And as I've seen over the 30 plus years, the growth of government and the expansion of that. The second comment I would make is that quite often, if not always, it seems like things that begin as a very good thing, man has in a very inartful way of actually turning into a bad thing, or certainly a manipulation of that. And so I think that a number of the counterterrorism tools that are available, and I'm very familiar with what Treasury does in a number of areas, put in the hands of individuals without appropriate checks and balances will go down a slippery slope of more and more intromission into the privacy and civil liberties area of individual citizens.
Hello, I'm David Ehrenman. You mentioned Vladimir Putin, Russia, and Ukraine. Do you believe, to be blunt, do you believe that action should be taken by Western nations, and if so, what sort of action?
Should actions be taken on Vladimir Putin? Let me start with the dilemma, and then potentially the response to the dilemma. The dilemma today is that I fear that you see, and particularly with Germany and Chancellor Merkel, a deepening divide even with the United States over the type of response on behalf of the Ukrainian war, by lack of any other description. It's a war. The separatists clearly have the Russians completely embedded with them, and so forth. If you look at the map of about August 2014, Kiev actually had pushed back on the separatists fairly dramatically. You look at the map today, and it's radically different because of Putin's success there. And what I fear is that you back to my comments about if you don't believe in inherent evil, you then don't really see the need to respond with strength. I think there's also this naivete that sanctions alone will solve the problem. I personally come from the view that you have to significantly arm the Ukrainian forces with at least defensive weaponry. My belief is that the Europeans, led by the Germans, are adamantly opposed to that, and that's a real problem. So until you can bring those two parts together, you have to remember there are profound economic interests by Europe in Russia, in the post-1990-91 world of Russia, heavy German and other European investments in Russia that are at stake. And so there are subterfuge pressures on the political systems inside the European countries to forestall further action against Putin. But here's my prediction. If you don't do something in where he sees strength responding to strength, he will continue to advance. And he'll advance largely, I believe, in a low-intensity conflict format, not in a outright hot war in the big sense of large battalions coming across the Russian borders into the Baltic countries and so forth, but will continually undermine it. I worry a lot about Moldova and the Transnistria area that has, wherever you have large ethnic Russian populations in the Baltic countries, in Moldova, in the Transnistria area, he will continue to expand his influence. He wants a near abroad that's responsive to Moscow.
Yes.
And at all costs to divide NATO. And that, if you want to know what his agenda is, that's essentially it. And if he can drive a wedge between Germany and the United States, which to date he's been fairly successful in doing, that's the problem. I personally believe, let me just add a postscript to this, a tremendous opportunity was missed on the policy side. Literally the days after is in singular number of days, handful of days, in the response to the shoot down of the Malaysia airline in eastern Ukraine. Putin got away with murder.
Literally.
And that's what you have to call it. We should have responded with creating a safe passage corridor to that aircraft, brought in the NATO forces, and I mean literally within 24 hours, because you started losing the message 36, 72 hours later. And you notice Putin came out okay. Yeah. Now, the Dutch obviously fought to get the bodies back, and there were arguments about retrieval of the dead and so forth. I'm talking about the geopolitical strategic response that was available to us, and we missed the window.
If we could, I would like to bring this in for a landing, maybe almost going back to where we began. My students will confirm the fact that I talk a lot about calling and the importance of that, particularly in the national security and intelligence profession. It is also a process, as you alluded, in terms of you understanding some things today that even 10, 15, much less 20 or 25 years ago were certainly not as clear or as understood as they are today. How would you describe perhaps some of the milestones or even some of the process that you went through personally to develop that sense of the direction that God would literally call you to move toward? You alluded to some of the decisions that you made. Can you give us any insight as to the process or the thinking that went on in various stages of your career that have essentially brought you to where you are today?
Let me give you three things that have worked in my life to respond to your question, not necessarily because they're magical that will work in every person in this audience or that reads the World Magazine article. But here are the three things that have been milestones in that growth. The first is the spiritual journey. And that spiritual journey has taken me to a profound passion for people. As someone who grew up in a home that never witnessed a fight between mom and dad, never, ever heard a four-letter word, never even knew about conflict in home, more generally. Yeah, four brothers, we had our spats, but it was really nothing. I thought that was normal. And what I have come to recognize in that spiritual journey is that you have to meet people where they're at, not where you are or where you've been. And that's the brokenness in people, including yourself, obviously, as fallen in original sin. So the passion for people has grown with time. And all the rest sort of falls into place then by way of mission if you take care of the people. And that's often said in the military services and so forth. but I'm talking about the whole person. It's really understanding and getting to know them in terms of the burdens that they carry. Second observation is that we're a community of people, and we often give lip service to that, and I don't want to demean it. But in real practice, to the young people, let me encourage you, find mentors. Find at least one or two with a very strong spiritual foundation in that mentoring. As I like to say of the senior pastor who is a mentor of mine from Reston Bible Church, and his name is Mike Minter, he's my Mike Minter mentor. In the sense that he's someone that I can constantly look to as someone to literally bounce things off of that have a God worldview perspective to them. Not in the classified arena, obviously, but
Yes.
that's the kind of person. And he, among others, believers, have really worked in my life in that way. And then the third one is much closer in. And I have been, and I've mentioned Lisa, my wife, the walk with her and the growth in our own lives as the pivot point for everything else by way of the relationships with other people begins in that partnership that I have with my wife. And that has kept me grounded, not with the titles, not with the positions, not with the authorities, but grounded in a relationship with one other human being that's the closest person on earth that I have that relationship with. It's the no-holds-barred relationship. And having that kind of person has also added to those milestones. Oftentimes, she couldn't be part of my daily work life because of the nature of the work. But when I would get home and dinner was always served, if it wasn't that there wasn't also a night event, and always up for our family devotions in the morning at 5 a.m., day after day, that started the day off well. And that has only grown in time. The soulmate-ness of that has deepened over time. So I am extraordinarily blessed to have a wonderful woman in my life that has strengthened that as well.
Great. Thank you. Lisa, I don't see where you're sitting out there. Would you just wave at us? There you are. You're behind someone. Thank you so much for being with us here today as well. Well, David, you mentioned earlier, not here, that it wasn't a dentist appointment that you avoided in order to come to be with us today, but it was an interview at the CIA. Thank you so much for being with us today. Can we thank him together, please?